I would like to start this session with Minister Chapman. Thank you very much, Minister, for coming back so soon after the last time you were here. We really do appreciate the amount of commitment that you're giving to this committee. We value your engagement and it really helps us do our job, so thank you very much for that. We've got two sessions with you today on two inquiries that we're currently running. So one is on displaced people and the other one is on value for money. I will warn you, we are expecting votes either once or twice during this session, so we will suspend the session when that happens and come back to you as soon as we possibly can. But Minister, because we've got you in front of us, I'm afraid I'm going to have to take the opportunity to ask you about two topics unless colleagues have others that they want to bring in. So one is on the estimates that came out about your department's spending, which I think had some quite significant changes in that we'd just like to get clarity from you on. And again, if you're not able to give us the answers right away, if you could get back to us in writing, that would be deeply appreciated, because it is something of concern. And the other one is personally, what's going on in Gaza right now is I can't cope anymore, Minister. And whilst I'm very grateful that the government does seem to be moving in what I would consider the right direction in terms of the actions it's taking to call out what are quite egregious acts, particularly against civilians and civilian infrastructure, I would like to just push you a little bit more, Minister, starting on one specific thing. The International Court of Justice on the 19th of July gave an advisory ruling towards Israel's conduct towards Palestinians across the West Bank and East Jerusalem, saying that it amounts to forcible transfer. What I don't understand is, why has the government still not given an official response to that? Because it is something that you would expect, particularly as both our Foreign Minister and our Prime Minister are lawyers, and they repeatedly say that they respect international law, that it would be something that they would be able to give a formal response to. Why has that not happened?
I mean, to begin, I recently returned from Israel and the West Bank, and while I was there, or before I made the visit, 2 days before that, we did our statement where our Prime Minister and Mark Carney and Emmanuel Macron made a very, very clear position about what we think is happening, about the displacement of people, about the use of food and hunger to move people. We were very clear about that. We've also made a clear statement alongside 27 other countries, donor countries, about the new plan for the distribution of aid into Gaza, which we think, well, we said before it had started, wasn't going to work, and the things that we were worried about happening are now happening. And the reports that we hear coming out of Gaza around the use of force and guns, around the distribution of food and water, we predicted, and I feel exactly the same as you do about what is happening, and we're making that position as clear as we possibly can, privately, publicly. We summoned the ambassador. We have paused negotiations on the trade agreement with Israel, specifically because of that.
That's the future trade agreement.
Yes.
That's not the current trade agreement, though, is it?
We don't have an FTA with Israel at the moment. We were negotiating to get one. We've now paused that because we just don't feel it's appropriate to continue at this time.
But our trade envoy still went out there last week, I think.
He did. I mean, there is still trade, and in the future, we want to have trade with Israel. Israel is an ally. We are close to the people of Israel for many, many reasons. But the government there at this moment, making the decisions that it is about aid specifically, from my point of view, we think is wrong, and it felt like an appropriate step to take to pause those negotiations.
Minister, I don't want to preempt, but you are very aware that this committee has been working on international humanitarian law, particularly around the killing of humanitarian aid workers, and we would hope that that report will be coming out imminently. There are many things that the government could do. So whilst we welcome joint statements, there are joint actions that you could be doing, which would be incredibly powerful. So if, for example, you were working with France and Canada again to look at joint sanctions that we could be putting in place, or joint blocks on arms exports, for example, that we could be putting in place, that would be much more powerful than a joint statement. But most important, Minister, would be acknowledgement and a response to the ICJ ruling, because that is what triggers whether or not there are war crimes going on and our legal duties to respond accordingly. So can I ask you again, when are we going to get the government's statement on that?
I don't have an answer to that today, Chair, but I completely accept what you're telling me about statements, and I agree with you. I would have hoped that statements such as we made and the actions that we took 2 weeks ago now as a response to what we anticipated was about to happen with aid in Gaza that is now happening, we would have hoped that that would have had more of an impact than it appears to have had on the decisions being made by the Israeli government. That has not happened. So clearly we need to keep all other options under consideration. You wouldn't expect me to comment on sanctions.
Wouldn't mind if you want to, Minister.
Well, I don't think we would ever do that ahead of time, but obviously if what we've done to date hasn't had the impact that we want it to have, then we need to look at what else can be done, because what we see happening in Gaza now and the failure to get food to people who are hungry on the brink of starvation.
It's man-made famine that's going on.
It's a decision that's been made by the Israeli government. This is not a natural disaster. This is not something that could not have been prevented. These are the consequences of choices that are being made by people in positions of authority. And for that reason, we will continue to look at what levers we can use to change the situation. I think it is important that, yes, we do what we can as the United Kingdom, but also to work closely with our allies and partners. We've worked with Canada and France most closely, and we'll continue to do that. But this is a situation that, to me, is worsening by the day. I would have hoped that the measures we've taken so far would have had more of an impact than they appear to have had. But you are quite right to raise it and remind us just how desperate this is. It's appalling, and day by day we get more and more reports coming out, and it's I fear what will emerge when journalists are eventually allowed to report from Gaza, because at the moment we know what the information we're getting is not complete, and it's an appalling situation.
Minister, I just don't want to be here in a year when we're expressing regret that we didn't act further and faster. But every day that goes by, I do feel that.
Yes.
And Tom Fletcher last week, the head of UNOCHA, he suggested that Israel is withholding food in order to force Gazans to vacate their land to seek food.
Yes.
So does the government accept that analysis?
I said that myself. I think almost 2 weeks ago today, I said words to that effect. And I, like you, do not want to be here. Well, it's not about how we feel, is it?
No,
it's
we're
completely
irrelevant in this.
But we don't want to look back as the international community and ask how that was allowed to happen.
Allowed to happen because we don't act, Minister, and you're the person in this room that can act. So please, anything you can do to stop this slaughter and get the hostages home, because
yes.
I can't even imagine the horror that their families, let alone the hostages, are going through. We have to use
yes.
every single tool in our toolbox.
I completely accept that, and I was able also to meet the families of hostages who are desperate. They can see what is happening. They want their loved ones, or sadly, in many cases, their bodies to be returned. The work that's being done by those families and the dignity that they've shown and the coherence with which they've articulated their voice, when inevitably there will be differences of political view and approach The most important thing is to get those hostages home where they belong, and then to get aid into Gaza and to prevent what is now clearly a humanitarian crisis.
100%. Monica?
Can I thank you, Minister, and thank you for sharing your distress. I think we all share the same distress, and it's day after day, as you said and as Chair said. When we're talking about days, what time frame is the government waiting for in order to make their next move?
Well, we're not waiting for anything. If there is something we can do immediately that would have the impact that we all want, then we will be doing it. And it's disappointing isn't the right word. It's devastating to see an elected government consciously choose the decisions that it is, having the impact that we all predicted would happen, that Tom Fletcher in the UN said would happen, that NGOs waiting on the border with trucks full of supplies said would happen. All of the major NGOs while I was there, they were all desperate to get. They don't need to have guns to distribute aid in Gaza. They can do this peacefully, at scale, at speed. They could do it immediately. And that's the devastating thing, is that this is just so avoidable. So we're not waiting for something to happen. It's happening. It's been happening already for the last 2 weeks, and and the blockade before that. So if there was a lever we could pull that would have the impact that we want this afternoon, then we would be doing it. The only people truly who can change the situation now is the government of Israel.
Minister, do you feel that you're pulling every lever?
I think we are, but I think when there is more that we can do, and we're having those conversations constantly internally, then we have to, because as the Chair has said, we're accountable for what we do and don't do, and the choices that we make and the positions that we take, and we can all see, perhaps not as closely as we would like, but we can all see what's happening here, and aid is being withheld, and that should never ever. That should not be what is happening.
Minister, you've talked yourself about we can see what's going on. It would be very helpful to have independent journalists inside Gaza at the moment. Is the government calling for the BBC to be allowed into Gaza?
We think there should be independent reporting, absolutely. The BBC has responsibility for its journalists, and the safety of journalists is something that matters to us as well. And I think really this would be a question for somebody with more expertise in reporting from these kind of contexts. But from what I can gather, should the government there permit this, then there are journalists who would feel confident that they could, with adequate safeguards in regard for their own safety, do more than they're able to do at the moment.
I don't understand, Minister, sorry, I probably shouldn't speculate on this, why it is that Israel has got the right to ban journalists from Gaza. I cannot think of any other war situation where this has been allowed to happen, and worse than that, because journalists are clearly being targeted. And, thank goodness for the brave people that are trying to document what's going on. But also, I don't know if you heard the Today programme this morning, we need to have an independent inquiry into just what is going on now. And whilst the Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel said that Israel would do the inquiry, that's not an independent inquiry. And so it's accountability is important, Minister. So we know and understand and appreciate that you're doing all you can, but our report will come out and we've got suggestions of maybe some more that you could be doing. So I would be really grateful if it could have your attention.
Oh, absolutely. And, why, I think, is a very good question. I think we can all speculate as to why, but Israel does control who goes in and who leaves, and there isn't, even the most tenacious of journalists would fail to be able to get where they would like to be at the moment.
Thank you. Can I move to an equally important but somewhat more dry topic of estimates? Monica, do you want to start?
Yes, please, if I may. On first glance, the estimates seem to show a rebalancing away from multilateral aid to bilateral aid, Is that replicated in the priorities?
So you're talking about 25-26?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what we've had to do, because the decision was made in February, what I didn't feel comfortable doing was just continuing with our in-year spending as had been budgeted, knowing that at the end of that financial year we were going to face a substantial reduction and then an even more substantial reduction the year after that. So what we decided to do was to try and create headroom this year. So we embarked upon a process where we said to posts, look, do continue doing things that we're already committed to, because we didn't want to walk away mid-programme or mid-contract, and continue with your humanitarian work. But other things, if you think that actually you need to continue, then you need to let us know what it is you're continuing with and the reason why you think it's important that we do that. And that could be around reputational damage, or it could be that they felt that in order to responsibly exit a programme, that there would need to be some additional spend to smooth that out. And posts have been really good about how they've handled that process, but that's meant that we haven't stuck to what was originally budgeted for this financial year, because we wanted to create headroom. We've been reasonably successful at that. I don't have yet sort of the final outcome figures of that, but what that will enable us to do is to just it enables us to plan better. But so that's been, I don't think the network has enjoyed that process especially, but I think we've all sort of had it out and agreed that when the Prime Minister says go line by line, that's what I had to do, and that creating headroom is probably a good idea in these circumstances. What I want to do next, though, is to work with the network around and external stakeholders as well about how we use that headroom, about how we plan from here on in. What I really want to do is to get posts on 3-year, sort of, with want of a better word, deals, so that they can plan, because there will be less money, and everyone's got a view about the rights and wrongs of that decision. There is less money. So the least worst thing we can do is allow posts that ability to plan in a multi-year way, so they can get more value which might be straying into the next session. But I think that really matters. So I think that's been quite well received and understood by programme managers. So it's not ideal to be doing these things mid-year, but because of when the decision to make the cut was made, and because we wanted to make sure that we had flexibility, that's the approach we've taken.
So we shouldn't use this as a harbinger of what's to come, of where the priority is?
No. I mean, I inherited a set of budget decisions. The budget then almost halved, so you've got to make some pretty quick choices. I've tried really hard to do that sort of collaboratively with officials and with the network. We haven't been able to do the consultation that I would like. I want to use the summer to do much more engagement. I think we've got some incredibly talented people working for the department in posts, and I would like to be able to give them more creativity, more control over what happens. So exactly how we do that is one of the things we're going to be talking about over the next few months, so that I would anticipate, you will hold me to this, in the autumn, being able to come back to you with sort of more information about how those 3-year arrangements will look, and also by then obviously we'll have made announcements on things like Gavi, IDA and those things. So the picture will be far, far clearer.
Minister, geeky detail here.
Yes.
The budgets to the embassies, is it going to the ambassador or is it going to the head of development? Because some places the two are basically on the same sort of salary level. Some, the development might be on a lesser footing. So, and they can come from very different positions when it's to do with development spend. So one of the issues that we have is that the merger has left certain things incomplete, and there are people on different terms and conditions and different pay. One of the things we're starting to see more and more is that the head of mission
is the development director. Came from DFID, as they would have said before Ollie Robbins told them to stop saying that.
No, they'll still say it.
Yeah, they do still say it, but we need to get away from that. So I don't think, for example, Helen Winterton in Jerusalem, former DFID, Darren, I forget his second name, Welch in Addis is former DFID. So these people are now head of mission, and they are leading those posts with a very strong development background. And I think that's the vision. So where you do have, and I know these situations as well, where there are sort of anomalies remaining. It's a bit outside my remit to get involved in the sort of HR side of things, but I think it is important that we complete that merger process properly.
So sorry to push you again.
Okay.
So is it your hope that the most senior person in charge of development, or with seniority in development, would be the person in charge of the budget?
In charge of the development budget?
Yes.
Yes. Well, yes. But these things, I don't think it's quite as cut and dried. It shouldn't be as cut and dried as that, should it? Because ideally, our political, our diplomatic, our development activities are all complementary. So what we wouldn't want, I think, from what I understand, in the days when we had two separate departments, you would have different operations, sometimes acting out of sight of one another, sometimes cutting across one another. I hope that doesn't happen anymore.
The flip of that is, I can see if you're negotiating a trade deal, you probably don't also want to be negotiating a development deal alongside, and if that was coming from two different people, because you don't want to stray into any areas of conflict of interest.
I would hope that there would be sufficient communication and sharing of objectives across the team, that shouldn't be a problem, I would hope.
Alice?
Yeah, thank you, Minister. I just wanted to clarify just the process. So obviously you said that the different kind of missions were looking at what they would stop. When will that detail be published? And then just my other follow-up was, the estimates say there's an uplift for the World Service budget, which is obviously welcome. The British Council was also waiting, but I just want to understand how the World Service budget has been announced already, just so that I understand that process. But really, when will we get the detail on what's been stopped? Is that after the spending review?
We could publish some of it now, I suppose, because there are decisions that have already been taken. I don't think we've made any choices about that. I mean, there are sensitivities around some of that, obviously with particular countries, and we don't want to necessarily present that in a thoughtless way. And some posts have been faster at doing things than others, and so. But in terms of when we would publish that, probably I don't know. I want to give you a date and then
Minister,
miss it.
Could I just lead you then?
Yes.
Because the Home Office has shared with the through the estimates process that their ODA budget is 2.3 billion.
Yes.
And it just seems odd that the FCDO hasn't shared what their ODA budget is. So we're being told that we have to wait until the breakdown that comes at the end of July. So if there was a way that you could speed that up, that would be extremely helpful and would help all of us with our scrutiny.
Yeah, I'm really happy to look at that. So
that would be great.
Fine.
Minister, we will come back.
Yes.
Order. I will briefly suspend this session. We are now restarting this International Development Committee's session with the Minister. Minister, could we just ask you a couple more on estimates? First one. Sorry, there's another bell. I'm not convinced that we are voting on this one. So I'm going to ask the question, Minister, and then we might have to shoot off. In the last couple of years, FCDO has been underwriting, or rather making guarantees on a lot of quite high-risk projects. It's now up to, I think it's 4.8 billion in this current estimates, which, as they're in conflict zones, a lot of them, is quite a risky strategy. So do you have some sort of policy or approach in place if one of those guarantees basically goes belly up, because it could literally take out the whole of the FCDO budget, if not more?
Well, I mean, I think on guarantees, they're a very good way of us being able to use our position to be able to support investment. You are voting.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, it's fine.
Give us the...
Okay, I mean, I think guarantees are great. I mean, I'll keep it really succinct. Guarantees are good because they get investment where it needs to be, and they're essential because if we didn't have guarantees, then the cost of investment would be far, far higher, or the project or whatever it is we're trying to do would not be investable, and the thing wouldn't happen. And you would end up having to use ODA or grants in order to get the outcome that we want, so guarantees are good. We are very mindful of risk, and we don't... we spread our risk so that if something did go wrong, it would be contained, and that it's a risk that we feel confident that we would be able to withstand without impacting the rest of our programming. There we go.
Thank you. Do you want to do yours quickly, and then we'll move to Displaced when we come back?
Yes, very briefly.
Very briefly. Go on, go.
Priorities for the main estimates. I trust are hot off the press, new. Do they provide a good indication of the overall direction of travel for development policy, and if so, how do they interact with our kind of wider development goals?
So we've said that priorities going forward will be our humanitarian work, and then health and climate as well. As I sort of explained at the beginning of the session, the decisions that we've made for 25-26 don't quite reflect that, because they're amendments to a budget that was set before the decision to reduce the ODA budget was made, and therefore they are, for want of a better word, a bit messier, and they've had to be made quite quickly. It's not how ideally we'd like to be making decisions. We've had to invent a whole process around it. It's been done at speed, but it's been done to the credit of officials incredibly well. And I think, you know, we await the NAO's verdict, of course, but I feel that we've done as good a job as we could have done in the circumstances, because the alternative would be to continue as we were, not create the headroom, and then leave ourselves with far harder decisions to make in the future. What we're doing now is working closely with posts, and we're also hopefully the intention is to be able to put them on longer term arrangements by the end of the year.
Minister,
you don't have to
I'm
run
afraid
fast.
We're going to have to suspend this session, and we will be back as soon as we possibly can. Recommence this session, Minister. Thank you so much for your patience. One last question on estimates from David Mundell.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, I know it just happened just before you arrived in post, but there was a proposal for the FCDO personnel located in Abercrombie House at East Kilbride to move to a new campus in Glasgow. That decision was reversed, and the decision was to remain in Abercrombie House. But when we had previously met with a FCDO, civil servants, they had advised us that Abercrombie House was not fit for purpose and would require adjustments to be able to, if it was to be the continuing second headquarters of FCDO. But in the estimates, whilst there are provisions to upgrade Lord Mandelson's residence in Washington, there is no provision to spend any significant funds on Abercrombie House. And given that we were told that without investment it wouldn't be able to fully perform the function, all functions that would be wanted there, I wonder if you can provide an explanation for that.
In the sort of golden rule of never attempting to answer questions about which I know absolutely nothing, because as you say, this was a decision taken before I was appointed, I'm going to defer to one of my colleagues, hopefully, who would be able to provide some more information.
Thank you. So you're absolutely right. The plan was to invest in a site in Glasgow, and we were under discussions on a contract for a building in central Glasgow. Through several rounds of conversations with the Treasury, it became clear that that wouldn't be economically viable, that in effect the cost was too great. And so that plan fell away. And now the question is, how do we remain fit for purpose in the Abercrombie House site for the foreseeable future?
Linda, I'm really sorry, just because of time. So are you making capital investments to make the site fit for purpose?
Once we have our spending review confirmed, we will make a decision about whether to submit plans for capital to make AH fit for purpose, once we have our final budget confirmed.
But I mean, the core there is it's not fit for purpose currently.
The core is that there are aspects of the site which mean that not all staff, if we were to have an FCDO split site, could do their work securely, and that matters particularly for those who need to work on the high side. And that was behind the comment of not fit for purpose. So that would be where the investment would be required, yes.
And that matters in the context of it being the FCDO's second headquarters, because it wouldn't be capable of fulfilling that function.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, that's quite a scary limbo, but you think by next Wednesday we'll know the answer to that?
No, I don't think we'll know by next Wednesday. We'll know what our final spending review settlement is and be able to work on the basis of understanding our capital allocation and how we want to allocate that capital allocation, but we won't have confirmed plans for AH by next week.
Minister, if I can just say, the people working for FCDO up in Scotland have been in limbo for a number of years now. We went and saw the site in the previous Parliament, and it wasn't fit for purpose then, and it was very much limiting the sort of roles that they could do. So if you could expedite this and give them that clarity, it would really, really be appreciated.
Happy to do that.
Thank you. We now turn to an hour and 7 minutes in the session that we were meant to be having on displaced people. It's an ongoing inquiry, and Minister, you'll be very aware that displacement is at its highest level in the modern era. At the end of June 24, more than 120 million people worldwide remain forcibly displaced, and that's been going up every year for pretty much the last decade. So that's 1 in 67 people around the world is displaced, which is quite a shocking figure. It's a priority for this committee for many reasons. If I could basically go straight into the questions, and can I say to committee members, you will have been WhatsApped the new order of questions. We'll run this session for 25 minutes and then we'll go to the second session. So, Minister, does the FCDO have an overarching strategy on how to prevent and respond to displacement?
We do. And it does start, as you indicate, with prevention. We understand that conflict is one of the principal drivers of displacement, and we see that in the sort of biggest displacement crisis there is right now in Sudan. So we work where we can to try and use all our levers to prevent conflict and prevent displacement from occurring in the first place. When that has not been avoided, we would work to protect those populations that find themselves in the most desperate of situations. And then we need to find long-term solutions. I think one of the things that I've learned since coming into this post is that now becoming a refugee or finding yourself living in a camp or being displaced in some other way is unlikely to be a very short-term thing to happen to you, and that you find yourself living in those conditions with your life on hold, with your access to basic services having to be either very, very limited or provided in ways that none of us would wish for a very long period of time. So we're having to work with host governments, specifically and to a large extent in places like Jordan, Lebanon, Chad, South Sudan, to try and make sure that they're able to do what we would all wish to see provided for those populations, whether that's food and water, healthcare, education for their children. And then, we do work with agencies like UNHCR and others to try and support people when they're ready to, and when it's right to be able to return. And some of the conversations that have struck me was in Jordan when I went to visit Syrian refugees living in a camp there who've been there for many years now. And not everybody wanted to return, but many did. And trying to talk to them about what they needed to give them the confidence to do that. But a lot of it, I think, is going to come down to how we're able to support Syria and how successful the government in Syria is and how stable that country becomes and whether it's safe for those people to make that journey, and they will make their own judgments about the safety for themselves and their families. So it's complicated. There are many different aspects to this. We work, prevention, protection, and then longer term support is the framework we apply, but it's very, very different in different contexts.
The last time you were here, you outlined your priorities.
Mm-hmm.
Where do displaced people fit within those priorities? Because there doesn't seem to be a natural home for them.
I think the majority of the work we do for displaced people would fall into the humanitarian priority. But then, outside of that, then obviously there's healthcare as well, and climate is exacerbating some of the conditions that displaced people find themselves in. We know that Jordan is under huge pressure with water and drought, and equally Chad as well. So the things that we would put in place to support people in the longer term would fall into those categories. But I think the majority of it, and just in terms of where money goes, would be in the humanitarian priority.
Thank you. David Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. Does the FCDO have strategies in place to strengthen the private sector within fragile states as a form of stabilisation? I mean, for example, in Syria there's been an urgent need, given the years of oppression under Assad, to rebuild a very broken country and get the economy going again. If you could speak to that, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, Syria is a really interesting example because, we took some tough sanctions decisions, as did many other countries, for very, very good reasons against Assad and his regime. They're gone now, and there is no future for Syria without a stable government which is properly representative of the population and that can grow its economy. Because without that economic growth, you're not going to see the public services that are needed. If people can't support themselves and make a living, then they're not going to take the risk of returning. So we were one of the first to remove those sanctions on the regime, and the Americans followed very quickly afterwards. Fine, there's a lot more we need to do. So we're going to work. We want to work in as many ways as we can to try and bring that about. But I think, I think the way that you approach this task is going to vary enormously. Sadly, we're nowhere near being able to take that kind of approach in Sudan, where the conflict is raging, and the leadership that the Foreign Secretary has shown at the conference that we held here, all of these things in time, I think, will help. But are we at a stage where we can say to those refugees living on the border in Chad, you know, that have discussions with them about returning. That's not what's happening. So it varies enormously depending on the context.
Thank you. Brian.
Thank you. Minister, you set out that tackling climate change is one of your priorities. To what extent is climate-induced displacement an aspect of this?
Well, climate, for most people who are displaced, it's to do with conflict, and we know that. Climate is making it harder, for sure, because in some places it's making it harder to make a living. In other places it's making it harder for host communities to do what they want to do, and it's putting pressure on resources. And I mean, water is probably the best example, where a host community, they know that their supply of water is under pressure. They then see many thousands of refugees put demands on services. That is not a recipe for stability. So some of the work that we need to do is to make sure that there are those services available for the whole community. So climate is a huge concern for us with this, and I think while we're not seeing, you know, we don't see people arriving in the UK as refugees principally because of climate. It's about escaping conflict. You know, it's something that's increasingly having an impact on people's movement and our ability to support them in region.
The situation, of course, that you were mentioning about in Syria, and many of those refugees are in Jordan. So what's happening now in terms of helping those refugees that went to Jordan to come back to Syria? Is that part of the programme?
So, yes, but they're not being forced to return. So some are choosing to return. We're encouraging the government of Jordan to do visits for families where they may have been in Jordan living in a camp for some time, or many refugees in Jordan are not living in camps at all, they're in the community. But the ability to be able to return to where they grew up in Syria and to see the conditions they'd be living in, to make an assessment of, you know, some of them said to me, my mother is on regular medication. I want to know that she can get that healthcare support if we return. I want to know that my child can be educated in the way that I want them to be. I want to know that my house is still there. I want to know that the community that I live amongst now, I want to know what my community links are going to look like should I return. And I think all of that is completely understandable. There's also issues about the amount of possessions that people are able to take in a way that's supported by agencies and whether that's sufficient. So all of these conversations are being had. It's quite a pragmatic, practical approach we have to take to this. It's not, I think most people would like to be able to return, but the confidence they have to do that is very much dependent on exactly where in Syria they came from and what the conditions are like for them now.
Yeah, but with so many other pressing problems around the world at the moment,
Yes.
I guess that's going to also be part of that. Going back to the issue of climate, can you share any examples of climate adaptation programmes that the UK funds in order to prevent displacement? So in Chad, I visited an example of where we've supported an agricultural project, which is about making sure that, what was one of the good things about it, it was joint between refugees and the local host community, and they were able to, with our support, work on some irrigation ponds, quite basic stuff really, but where you're in such water pressure area, that is making the difference between them being able to sustain themselves and to be able to then have surplus crops and to be able to trade and to be able to support a community. That means that those people are able to stay there and build a life there, and they don't feel the need to move. And one of the things our understanding is growing about displaced people is you don't just start off in Sudan and find yourself in Tunisia. You're going to South Sudan, you're going back to Sudan, you're going to Chad, you're going to South. People move in region far, far more than they do interregionally. And being able to support a community like that, close to the border of Sudan, using initiatives that can alleviate the pressure. Chad's one of the most climate-pressured countries in the world. To be able to support that community there is really important.
Yeah, the Chinese, of course, have done a lot in terms of de-desertification in China. There also are some works in the Sahel, and presumably we could be doing more there to help people to survive the changes.
I mean, I think the sort of de-desertification work is really interesting, and I think one of the reasons we've put together our Sahel Fund is to sort of be able to do that work, which is on a regional basis. So they're not just working with our teams in Chad. We're actually looking across the whole region, and projects like that I think would be suited very well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sam, you wanted to come in?
Yes, well, I think you're really articulating very well, actually, the challenges of resettling displaced people after conflict, and also the tensions that can exist in those communities. And the UK in the past has been a funder of many social programmes on the ground doing just that. Obviously, with cuts to bilateral aid that we know are coming, those presumably are going to be projects that will be cut. Has the government done any impact assessment on the likely effect on displaced people? Are we likely to see, for example, an increase in displacement because of those tensions that will exist because of the programmes that we're going to cut?
I think we're trying to protect as much as we can our work on humanitarian programmes. But as far as the question about impact assessment goes, I mean, unless you think that around 40% of what we've been programming and funding had no impact and wasn't beneficial and didn't protect vulnerable groups, then there is going to be a detrimental impact. It's just the truth of it. So what that means is we have to understand what that impact's going to be and where we can mitigate that, limit it, work with partners, then we have to. There are programmes which I've paused, things like there's some of the cash that we've given, because we think we've got to do programmes that really only governments can do and work with governments, and not do things that might be better delivered by philanthropists. So there's decisions like that we're making, where we're going to pause things and try and and we will work in a different way, which we think will have a better long-term impact. And this is sort of straying into the next discussion on value for money. But you are right that we do need to look really closely at the effect of the choices that we make, and we understand that if you're doing something that is going to reduce support for displaced people, what are those people going to do? We need to understand that and plan for it.
I just wonder what the increased costs will be down the line.
Well, I mean, that's one of the impacts we'd have to understand, isn't it? I think.
Bring Noah in at this point.
If I may, very briefly before turning to a different topic, I think these are very interesting times that we live in. If we're on the one hand saying that we want to make greater use of, say, development finance and kind of financial tools for development, and at the same time we're arguing that we need to be doing increased work around tackling irregular migration and putting this emphasis on displacement. It's a very tricky thing to do, so I would love to hear perhaps more in writing in follow-up to David's question on, for example, Syria. How it's definitely easier said than done, isn't it, getting those mechanisms to work in countries where sanctions have only just been lifted. So I'd love to hear a few more of what you see as potential success stories could be in doing that. But turning to a different topic, climate finance, what does the FCDO define as climate finance today?
I mean, broadly, it's our development spend that's geared towards combating climate change or mitigating the impact. I think that's, I don't know if there's a more technical explanation.
That's right. So we use the OECD DAC climate markers to assess the extent to which a programme supports mitigation or adaptation. the totality of that supports our overall climate finance target.
Thank you. And perhaps briefly on this, so when we pressed your predecessor on the much talked about £11.6 billion, which I've certainly heard a lot about from my constituents, it was, I think we received something of a perhaps equivocal answer as to whether that was kind of truly new money or whether that was kind of programmatic money already part of the UK's kind of development programming. So I don't know if that is that figure still, is that commitment still there, and is there any new money going towards climate finance?
I think the search for new money at the moment is going to be pretty fruitless, if I'm being to be completely straightforward with you. But we are committed. Climate is one of our priorities. We're working through exactly how that looks and what money is going to be allocated to what at the moment. The spending review will help shed some light on that. But the classification of ICF is something that is sort of internationally agreed, and the way that we count that, we'll make sure we comply with the way that our international partners do it. But they will, you'll be able to scrutinise, you'll be able to challenge, you'll be able to see what we're allocating as climate and what we're counting towards that tally. But completely honestly, is there going to be any new money for climate in a world where we've just gone from 0.5 to 0.3? I think you can probably work that out.
And perhaps very briefly, lastly on this topic, are there things that we can do that don't involve investing or spending huge amounts of money to promote that goal that you've identified in the sort of estimates memorandum around restoring the UK's leadership on climate and nature finance?
I mean, I think ODA is one tool, isn't it? And the positions that we take, the decisions we make domestically about our energy mix, we've got to show, not tell with some of this stuff. We work, a lot with our technical assistants in countries and support work on grids and renewable energy. And there are many things we can do that aren't just about programming. And we also, I think, we're going to be talking to BII about their next sort of strategy, and it would be good to see climate feature more in the work that they do as well. But that's another thing that's ongoing. So I think there's a lot more that the UK can, should and does do in terms of climate leadership globally than our ODA allocations.
Thank you. David Mundell.
Hey, thank you. Minister, can I ask you what you see as the role of multilateral institutions, alone or in partnership with the UK, in preventing and responding to displacement?
I think that multilaterals have got a key role to play, particularly IDA. And I think we get so much more return on our investment if we work through our multilateral partners. The key to it, I think, all of these things go together, don't they? So we know that conflict causes displacement, but we know that economic instability can lead to conflict, and political instability, and all these other things all fit together. So the work that we can do with our multilateral partners on trying to get that economic stability piece right, I think in the long term is one of the best things we can do in terms of preventing displacement. But we work, I think, sort of more on the supporting people in region with our partners at the UN and through those agencies. And from what I've seen, they do an incredible job in the most difficult of circumstances of supporting people and making sure they get the services that they need. But that is not a long-term answer. And I think that's what I keep coming back to, is just how long people are left in these circumstances for, and what it is we ought to be doing to prevent them having to be displaced in the first place, but enabling them to rebuild their lives, whether that's in the host country or whether that's where possible, if they want to, when they can return.
And do you think that our influence across these multilateral organisations will be maintained with cuts in contribution?
I think so. Yes, I do think that. I'm not sure that we've always been as clear or as demanding as we could have been, because there's been more money, but now that the money is reduced, not just from the UK but from others as well, I think everybody that I meet internationally, everyone's saying that we need to have change, that the multilateral system needs reform. Everybody agrees with this. What there isn't sufficient clarity on yet, although we're getting there, is exactly what that needs to look like.
I was going to ask you that, because
Yes.
you've said that.
Yes.
But do you have specifics in mind, or is that something that's evolving?
I mean, it is evolving. Obviously, I've spoken to Tom Fletcher about the changes that he wants to make, and we're supportive of the UN 80 process. We've got financing for development coming up in Seville very shortly, where we need to have a very clear position on how we want things to change there as well. So there are sort of multilateral events coming up shortly where I want to see the UK representation arguing for something, for reform and for change alongside partners in a way that's clear and deliverable, and that isn't just part of some sort of mushy kind of, we need to do things more efficiently. That everyone agrees there is duplication, and that there is efficiency to be found. So, the UK needs to use its position of still, major donor to exert that influence.
Matthew, may I just add, just one thing, just one very concrete example is that the World Bank is looking at its fragile states strategy at the moment. So we're engaging really closely with them to try to ensure that what comes out of that process is something that we think is really worthwhile and addresses many of the issues that members have mentioned today, including climate resilience, private sector in fragile states and so on, all of which can of course help to not only adapt to climate change and so on, but also reduce the drivers that force people on displacement. So that's just one concrete thing, for example, that we are using the position we've got on the board to influence.
Thank you. Monica.
Thank you. What forms of data does the FCDO collect on the displaced people who interact with your programmes?
Forms of data?
Yeah. Right.
So, I suppose there are different ways perhaps to answer that. I can give perhaps one very concrete example of where we've used data to try to improve things. So in Somalia, we have a programme with the Somali government which has been helping to identify where IDPs are, using satellite data and otherwise to identify things that look like IDP settlements and so on, and using software to identify them, and then putting that together with our partner, in that case it's the International Rescue Committee and Gavi, to find ways to make sure we're able to vaccinate children who've never been vaccinated before. So using the data that's coming from that to identify where the people are, and then using that to design the programs and the supply chains and so on to get vaccinations to people. So that's a concrete example. I don't know if that's what you were getting at as an example, but...
That's useful, but what about the people that interact with your programs at the other end? How do you collect that data? So you're looking at, as far as I understand, you're kind of looking down and you're seeing that they need some help. We're designing a program around them. But what about collecting the data of those people that you have helped, and what data do you collect on that?
So do you know if they're coming from a particular minority group or region or age or ability, or how do you know where your money is going to?
Did you want me to jump in?
Yeah, you can.
So all our programs are required to have disaggregated data when we do monitoring and evaluation, and that tries to look at both gender, but also age and ability. It doesn't, I don't think, look at ethnicity and geographic location.
Religion?
Or it does.
No.
It does look at religion. I think it is intended. It can. We try and look where we can at.
Just thinking
religion
how
and
we
belief.
can realise that there might be a particularly persecuted group, and target programmes accordingly, or people with particular disabilities are just not turning up. So does that mean that they can't physically get where they need to for the help, for example?
That's right. So that's why we try and go as far as we can when we can get good data, which is rare in many of these circumstances, to get right down to the granular level. But we can write to the committee on the extent to which that reaches the question of persecution and displacement.
Thank you.
Did you say it does cover gender?
Yes.
And down to adolescent girls?
It should. Age and gender, yeah.
Will the department implement the resilience and adaptation funding that was announced in the previous government's white paper?
Well, I mean, we are looking at all of our spending commitments at the moment, and you know, we're in a difficult situation, aren't we? But we are.
So one of the conversations that we've had with the minister is on the RAF, the Resilience and Adaptation Funding, and we've just been through a process which makes an allocation for that in 25-26. So the details of that will be released as part of the full estimate.
So that under the previous government, they announced that the FCDO would scope a separate fund of up to 15% of FCDO bilateral humanitarian provision. Is that the kind of figure you're looking at?
I don't think we can answer that today, can we? We are.
When you can answer it, could you answer it, please? And can I bring Alice in for one final question on this section, please?
Thanks very much. But I guess building on to the last question about disaggregated data, obviously women and girls are 50% of displaced people. We know a lot of girls within that amount as well. We spoke last time about women and girls, and also I think when Nick Dyer was here, he was saying that you would be publishing, I think, impact assessments in June or July. So I just wanted to ask, in terms of the programmes for displaced women and girls that you've been running, have impact assessments done on what cuts to those programmes would, what the impact of any cuts to those programmes would be?
Well, we haven't. I don't think we've made cuts to those programmes as yet, because they would be in our humanitarian project, and I'm imagining most of those would be getting delivered through our partner organisations in any case. But certainly, we stand by the commitment that we made to do the impact assessments and to share as much as we can with you.
Okay. Share as much as we can is a step back from sharing with us.
I feel quite relaxed about being maximalist in our approach to all of this.
You're the minister, so we'll take that answer. Thank you.
I am unclear as to why we don't ordinarily do this. So without being clear about that, I'm sort of slightly reluctant to commit to definitely publishing everything. But as someone who's been in your situation asking these questions, I would have pulled me up on that as well. So let me see what we can do, because I do think it's right that when we're making these decisions, and we're not in a place where we're pretending you can cut 40% of the budget plus and there won't be a detrimental impact. That's not what this department is doing.
Minister, all I will say is, in the last Parliament and the last round of cuts, we weren't allowed that information. We found a way to get that information and put it in the public domain, which was not a good look for the previous government, and I'm sure we're better than that.
We are better than that, and I'm aware of what happened.
Thank you. If we could now move on to value for money. This inquiry was started before this most recent round of cuts. It's something which this committee is somewhat obsessed about, because we're very minded of our obligation to the taxpayer to demonstrate value for money in every pound that's spent. But we're also very minded that value for money doesn't always mean the cheapest option. So if we could probe you a little bit, and Monica, if you could start, please.
Yeah, sure. And so, Minister, how would you personally define the term value for money?
So I don't have a personal definition. The government uses the NAO definition of this, which is someone who is married to someone on the PAC for many, many years. It's about, has what you've done and spent your money on delivered the things that you said you wanted to achieve when you started. And that's our approach to value for money. I do think when you're talking about development, though, it's slightly more complicated, because you can say our objective is to do this thing in this community, in this country. You can do that thing in that country, score very, very highly on value for money. What you're not looking at is what then happens in 10, 20 years' time, which is what development is really all about. So I think there is an extra layer around impact and sustainability that we're worried about, even though the straightforward NAO definition probably wouldn't look at that.
If I can come back to that definition in a minute, but sustainability is not included within the FCDO's value for money principles. Why isn't it? You've just referred to it.
Well, the 5 E's would look at that.
Yes, and actually it is included in the wider definition of value for money that we take. So we use the NAO and then we have the 4 or 5 E's. But then there's also wider definitions, international definitions of VFM that we consider, of which resilience is one. And also as part of our impact assessment, we look at the question of resilience too and sustainability.
You consider, but you haven't adopted them.
So sustainability and resilience aren't sort of formulaically captured, but they are part of our considerations.
Yeah, I mean, there are evidence from Action for Global Health and Oxford Policy Management seems to suggest that sustainability should be included within your framework, and it should go beyond the 5 E's to include sustainability.
I think it is.
So I think as the Minister describes, when we're looking at interventions, we need to balance, as will have been the case as part of that score, the sort of short-term impact in terms of vaccines delivered. But we also want our health strategy to support health systems over the longer term. And indeed, that is what we do. So I think I would actually challenge that feedback from OPM that that's something that we haven't considered, because it is what we consider as part of our health multilateral architecture reforms, as part of the work we do with the global health initiatives.
Okay, the programme operating framework defines value for money as value to the taxpayer, not to maximise the impact of those living in poverty. What's your reflection on that?
I suppose it depends what you think the taxpayer wants you to do, because if you think that we're spending their money on alleviating poverty, then our ability to do that is providing value to the taxpayer, I think. So I think if we're doing things, I think where the public gets annoyed a bit with this is if they think that they support the aims of development, but when they get cross about it is when they think we're making spending decisions that are not actually having the impact that we say we're going to have. And the challenge for the department constantly is about trying to make sure that everything we spend does have the impact that the public would want us to see their money achieving. So we had an example, I mean, I referred to it earlier, this example of social protection in Malawi, where we were providing cash, a decision made under the previous government, to a community to enable them to spend money on resilience, climate resilience for their homes. And on the, in some respects, that project, I expect, when it would come to be evaluated, we paused it because it just it didn't sit with what we were trying to do under the new decisions that we were making since the cut was made. But you could say putting extra money into the hands of that community has alleviated poverty within the time frame of the project. But if you were to go back in 10 years' time, would that have still been the case? Has that created a new way of supporting livelihoods in that community? Has the government there mainstreamed that approach? Have we done the systems reform, the policy changes, the building up that social protection system in that country to enable that investment that the UK taxpayer was making to actually make the impact that we want? And some of this is judgment, and some of it's evidence that you build up over time by trying these things and looking back and saying, actually, the best approach is to work with the government and get the policy and system change, rather than doing the thing that might get you the quicker impact. And it's, there's judgment involved in this, and it's about making sure that we adapt programs as we go, and that we learn from the outcomes of programs, and we're able to use that learning in future decisions.
Do you think that reducing poverty should be explicitly mentioned as a central tenet of the approach, as it was in DFID, value for money?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I think yes, there are secondary benefits to the way that you spend your development money, of course, and they're important, but unless you're alleviating poverty, then you're probably not going to get them. So we've talked about migration and prevention of displacement of people being a benefit. Yes, it is. And as is improvements in our ability to trade with a country as it develops. But that alleviation of poverty is the foundation of everything we do, and that's I don't know anyone who would disagree with that in the department.
Thank you. Minister, just because of time, we're going to start throwing questions at you. If you can throw short answers back at us, please. Noah.
Thank you. That was very clear on the purpose of our ODA. In regards to private finance, which areas of development do you feel that could be most useful in terms of contributing to value for money?
I mean, I think that's largely dependent on the country we're talking about. I think infrastructure. I mean, there are so many. What surprised me is just how the variety of investable opportunities that exists. And one of the things that we're trying to do, particularly with the World Bank, is to try and get more and more of the investment into the lowest income countries, into the sort of trickier places that are harder to get the commercial finance into. But I think because of the reduction in our amount of money that we have to spend, using those investment methods of getting change, they're going to have to be more widely deployed perhaps than they have been up to now.
And briefly, is there a country-specific approach to value for money to support what you've just said at all? Country-specific approach to value for money?
I mean, I think no, you have a single approach to value for money, but I think that what it is you're trying to achieve, which determines whether or not you've achieved value for money, does alter depending on where you are.
That's come early.
Thank you.
What do you want to do? Do you think that we can get
Roll
back
the
in
whips
time?
and just stay. No, left vote.
At the moment, order, I'm going to suspend this session. This session is now recommencing. Alice?
Thanks. So as you mentioned, the FFD conference is coming up in Spain. Can you just tell us what your priorities are for the conference?
Yes. Melinda, help. It's
So a handful of things which work to extend development finance, private capital mobilisation, debt transparency, domestic resource mobilisation, illicit finance, and women and girls.
Bond has said that the UK has so far rejected proposals for a debt workout mechanism. Is that right? Is that correct?
I don't know that we've rejected outright any proposals on debt. We're in conversation with Bond and others about what we can do on debt sustainability, and they've made proposals on debt legislation, which we've looked at with them and the Treasury and couldn't fulfil, but I'm not aware of having rejected a proposal on debt workout.
Just final question, what would a good outcome from that conference look like in terms of your priorities?
An agreed document, first
Right.
thing. The second would be that countries, in particularly, well, globally, but particularly in the global south, recognise the importance of building on the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and extend an agreed definition of the modern development finance landscape that we need to deliver the SDGs.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you. Yeah, just I want to ask about localisation and whether you feel that that offers better value for money than centrally managed programmes.
I mean, I hear varying things about this. If you speak to development directors in country, they pull a very snarly face about centrally managed programmes. But I am going to be looking at all of these because I think in the world that we're entering, where there's less money, we need to be able to make sure that we are getting absolute value from everything that we're doing and that we don't end up with centrally managed programmes sort of cutting across things that we're doing in countries. The whole thing needs to be much more joined up. We're going to be looking at the new operating model that we've been working on, and we want to speak to, that's part of the engagement process over the summer, so that we can figure out how we get the expertise that we have in country and the expertise that we have here in London working far more in a more synchronised way. I really like things that we've done on a more regional basis, where you have development directors able to design programmes collaboratively. I think that works really well. The balance between our centrally managed programmes and our bilateral programmes, I think, is something that we need to give some serious thought to and see where we can make sure that they complement each other, there's no duplication, everything's done within sight of each other, because I'm aware that we're just not going to be able to support the number of programmes that we have been up to now.
Go. Super, thank you. Has the government considered the role that philanthropic organisations can offer in developing value for money across its development priorities?
I mean, we're a government, not a philanthropic organisation, so there will be things that if you're a philanthropist that you want to fund, like the programme that we were talking about in Malawi. Mm-hmm. If you're Rory Stewart and you've got your charity and you're able to get people from Silicon Valley or wherever to invest in that programme and you can deliver, that's great. And I think that how they assess their value for money and what they're prepared to spend their money on is completely different to how a government needs to think and behave. And there are things that we're able to do working more in partnership with other governments that perhaps a philanthropic organisation would find more challenging. So one of the things that I want to do is try and work in a sort of way that's complementary to philanthropic organisations. I mean, really, I suppose an obvious example is the Gates Foundation and the work that's done on health and the way that we work with them very closely. We've got Gavi coming up as one of the examples of how we'll be doing that. So in an ideal world, the activity is complementary, so we do need to stay close to our sort of friends and colleagues who work through philanthropic organisations.
Is that what you mean?
Well, I'm thinking in the past you've done a lot of work with co-funding NGOs' work, for example, but there's also the issue of PwC and the work that it does with women and girls.
Yeah.
So it's really, has there been some thought as going forward? You've got a big cut in aid about how you can better deliver what desperately needs to be delivered.
I mean, only about 5% of our spend is done through other organisations in terms of the PwC private sector type stuff. There is there's an argument. I was quite surprised it was as low as that, if I'm honest. And some things are maybe better done through organisations. Other things we might want to deliver ourselves. And how we make those choices is all about value for money, but it's also about making sure we retain capacity and capability in FCDO. So how perhaps we need to be getting people who've been specialists in one thing able to do more, a bit like the conversation we were having about our diplomatic teams and people with development expertise. We don't want to be seeing them as two different cohorts of people anymore. They need to be one team.
Minister, we are very sorry for how we've had to stop and start this session. If it's okay, we'd like to put some of the questions we didn't get to you in writing, but these are sort of ongoing inquiries, so if we could get a timely response, that would be great. One final question from me. Next week is the UN Ocean Conference. The UK agreed to ratify the Ocean Treaty, which is a very significant document for the world, but also for us if we're looking to meet all of our obligations around biodiversity. When we've pushed for when we're going to ratify it, we've now moved to when the parliamentary timetable allows. That's great, but the government controls the parliamentary timetable. And at the conference next week, if you or whoever is going were able to outline what that timetable is likely to be, even if you're not going with a ratified treaty, I think that would give confidence to those whose lives literally depend on getting that treaty ratified. Could you give us some hope that we might get something concrete for next week, please?
I wish that I could.
You're honest, Minister.
Yeah, I know. I mean, what's the point? We are as committed as ever to this, and I gave evidence alongside Minister Hardy at the Environmental Audit Committee recently on this. So that commitment remains. I am told the same as you, that this is about parliamentary timetabling, which I know is fiendishly difficult, and a minister like me could pop up and say, but this is only a small thing, everyone agrees with it, why can't we just find time to do it? And the business managers look at you like you're a bit insane.
Minister, is so, if we're to meet our sort of 30-30 targets, if we're not going to see small island developing states literally submerged, we haven't got that much time.
No,
so
I appreciate that. I am happy to commit to go and have further conversations with business managers, and I'm sure that pressures that comes from elsewhere would be well received too.
Minister, as ever, you've been very gracious with your time and very honest with your answers. We appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you, committee. Order. This session is now